This is the 13th executive axiom. And in this axiom, I've titled it Executive Beliefs, Structure, and Organization. And so you kind of have to step back a little bit and think in terms of the design of an organization. There's some belief that went into why things, policies and procedures and processes and just the whole design of the organization based on somebody's belief that this was the best way to do it. The same thing goes for metrics and compensation and hiring and your sales approach and your marketing and security and technology. And all of these things are rooted in someone's belief that this was the best way to do it. Now, things change over time, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. But what I find is that executives really, well, it boils down to a couple of things, and that is trust. Do they trust their employees? Or, let's take the security thing, having worked with a lot of telecoms, and they have warehouses of iPhones and Samsung smartphones and, things that are expensive, and they've set up all these security systems. The worst I'd ever seen was in the UK. But, you had to, first of all, driving in, you had to go through security. And then once you got in, you went through a metal detector, and it just screamed trust, when you walk in. And, the pay is always on the low side. And so we can't trust these people to with our warehoused goods in order to send them out, because people steal them. And there are employees. So there's something seriously wrong with some of these systems. And I know people are going to say, well, that's just, the nature of people is to steal. Well, if your system's designed that way, they will. Most of them are, and they spend an amazing amount of money to do that rather than maybe pay their employees a little bit more, maybe put more of the decision making in the hands of the worker. So trust is a big issue. And then the second thing is control. And some of this is kind of from hubris, where I got all the answers. I'm the executive, by the way. So therefore, you doing what I say is part of the makeup of a way an organization is supposed to be run. And so those two things kind of drive a lot of the beliefs that are in there. You almost have to put them through the meat grinder in order to figure out what's going on in an organization. Now, I've talked before about Dunbar's number, which is a number of people in an organization. And what you find is that control and trust, control goes up and trust goes down when an organization achieves a size of about 150 people. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. Worked with organizations that have 100 people in it, where things have started to get a little bit out of hand. But you just think logically, when you first start an organization, maybe there's, just yourself or maybe 5 people in an organization. Then as it grows, you don't have the same relationship with 5 people than you do with 150 people. It's impossible to do. So you start to build these structures, and the way most of the time they're built are like major lack of trust and more control types of systems, because that's the only way to make sure people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so Dunbar's number becomes kind of that Rubicon that you cross and over into a different mindset with trust and control and these beliefs that you have about the way an organization is supposed to be designed. Because the big organizations, they have security and, all these things, the way they have technology and their metrics, and they all copy each other and they assume it's good. And sometimes it is, but not all the time. And matter of fact, probably not most of the time. But, you run into also when you're talking about people's beliefs. I'll ask an executive, why do you do this way? And they say, well, it's always been done that way. So there isn't a personal belief, but there was a belief at one point that had people do things a certain way. Now, what I also find is entropy takes over a lot of these processes, the way that things are structured in an organization. In other words, they'll deteriorate over time if they're not kept up. And so those beliefs maybe were, you thought, well, I was supposed to be doing it this way, and now they're doing it this way. How did we get here? And those are good questions to ask, because that now you're starting to unravel, first of all, what was the reason for something. And there was always I can't remember which book it came from, but to talk about the shank of a ham, and where the grandmother took the ham and cut off the shank and put it in the oven, and so the mother learned how to do it that way, and then the granddaughter finally asked the question, why are you doing that? And the mother says, well, because grandma always used to do it. And then the granddaughter goes and talks to grandma, and grandma says, well, I had to cut the shank of the ham in order to make it fit in the oven. Well, that wasn't a problem that they had today. So it was just something that people did, but not knowing a good reason for doing it. And so, one of the things that I've learned is, the mother in this case probably had what's referenced as a normative experience, which we'll get into here in just a second. But you can't change people's beliefs and their assumptions. In other words, you can try and convince someone they may comply as an executive. Somebody else sit there and say, well, you're just you're doing it wrong, but that doesn't really change the reason why I do it. And they may change their behavior for a while, but there was a reason why they were doing it the way that they were doing that countered the way an executive maybe designed it or believed it should be done. You didn't really change any thinking there. You just got compliance for it. So, the important lesson I've learned from advising and coaching and consulting with organizations is you can't change people's beliefs and their assumptions that they have. They have to change them on their own. So, as part of developing this normative experience where you're going out, where you're proactive in your belief and assumption and making changes to them. In order to do that, as I just said, I can't convince you. I can get compliance potentially, but usually as an advisor, I hold no power over anyone. So what I do is develop these normative experiences where you are getting immersion as a executive, where customers interact with your organization, because you can't, you can challenge your employees a little bit easier than you can challenge a customer, because customers could come in, start interacting with your organization, and the change really begins there. If something's out of whack, I usually can see it first, just because I've done it, for decades now. But an executive that's in the system, it's hard for any system to see itself. It's hard for an executive to understand that their beliefs or someone's beliefs along the line created the structure in which employees are working in and that customers are interacting with. And so you have to walk yourself through the process, and that's in essence what I do. And it's funny when you take an executive through. first one of the first things I'll do is go on my own. I'll just sit, listen to phone calls in a contact center. Them saying I'll observe what's going on in the organization, and then I will then have a good sense of what's happening in the organization, what the beliefs are in the organization, and then grab an executive. It might be the president of the organization, might be somebody on the executive team, and I take them through and I give them some exercises to do, and they'll go and they'll listen to these interactions, and it begins this normative experience begins the change that people see. Because again, I can't do it on my own, but I can put the executives in situations where they can observe and listen on their own. And the funny thing that you get often when you first put an executive in without it being designed very well, and I've gotten better at it over the years, but is they have a tendency to view things as right and wrong. Oh, well, they're just doing it wrong. That's why the customer's having problems. And what I try to get them to is why. Why are they doing it this way as opposed to the way that you think it's supposed to be done? And then now we're starting to ask good questions, because what executives often think is going on in an organization is not what's happening. And you could almost ask any employee in a large organization, they'll tell you executives don't have a clue, and you've got to get a clue. And so beginning this process is a lot easier. And employees aren't going to tell you everything, because there's some fear there, there's some respect there. There are some, I'm not going to challenge an executive because it puts me in harm's way, if you will. So that's how I basically began. Is I look on my own. I develop some experiences for executives to go through, so that they're seeing the same things, seeing and hearing the same things that I am when they go into the work. Now, again, I think the bottom line of this is I can't change your thinking. What I can do is set you up in a position to allow you to change your thinking. And, the executive has to change on their own. I can't change anything organization. And there's been engagements where I've gone in and, for whatever reason, executive, even though they see what's actually happening, and let me just give you an example, was we'll just call it a break fix or type of an environment. But a customer was asking why they had one technician come in to their organization and tell them one thing, and another technician came in and told them something else. And I knew it was the system they'd set up from an incentive standpoint, that one was working towards getting a new unit put in where they got a commission, and the other technician was working towards actually fixing the problem with that system. So, even when they see that, they sit there and say, well, I'm making money that way, so therefore I'm not going to change. Now, as in a customer, you might say, geez, well, that's not good. So there's certain things I'm bound to as far as organizations go, but kind of get the gist of what's going on, where an executive has to be willing to change their own thinking with regards to their beliefs and assumptions that they have. So that's what I wanted to cover in this axiom. And remember, there is always a better way.